Hi, I'm back again, and today we're going to be finishing Destroy Race, Destroy Society by Flowerbomb. We left off with, or I could sell drugs and survive on exploiting the addiction of others, further perpetuating a well-known and circulated racial stereotype. Capitalism has carved out a place in society for both the drug dealer and the law-abiding wage slave. Both options involve assimilating into the mental worship of capital, and, regardless of race, both options involve power dynamics that ultimately produce authoritarian relations. So today, one might understand why it's difficult for me, as an anti-authoritarian, to place value in identity as a reliable, prideful, unifying means of liberation. Especially since authoritarianism is capable of exerting power from within any racial category. Rather than making race or class-based assumptions about people, I prefer to see and treat each individual as a brand new experience. And rather than perpetuating the same generalizations that reinforce race-based stereotypes, I recognize every individual as complex. Blackness is not inherently essential to slavery, poverty, or being a drug dealer, just as whiteness is not inherently essential to superiority, prosperity, or law obedience. My own illegal activities, for example, are not essential to my racially assigned identity. What I do just happens to be the most practical way of expropriating my freedom, regardless of how others racially perceive me. In addition to instinctual survivalism, my illegalism could be understood as a personal expression of intentional sabotage and disgust for law and order. These very same views can be, and as encountered in my experience with others, are actively shared by people racially perceived as white as well. And let's be honest, I'm sure there are some black cops, judges, and prosecutors out there itching to lock my ass up. Through years of interacting with different people from different places, I have come to realize how limiting identity politics, privilege theory, and other contemporary anti-oppression theories really are. The idea of identity as solidarity fails to consider the liberation and desires of the individual, which get trampled by the imminent domain of a desperately collectivist worldview. Guided by victimist ideologies intended to homogenize and represent people of color as a monolith, leftism treats non-white individuals who reject this worldview as trivial or non-existent. I personally believe this is a product of democratic majority rules thinking. For example, if there is more writing from one brand of political ideology, especially one that uses lowest common denominator politics, then that ideology is often considered the standard by which all others are measured. It seems to me that the leftist objective is to popularize and celebrate marginalized racial identities from a collectivist ideological perspective, the zombified remains of Marxism, creating a dominant narrative that ultimately suppresses the perspective of any anti-left anarchist of color. By having more writing from this perspective, the collectivist ideology maintains the persuasive illusion of an irreproachable position of superiority. This dominant narrative is ultimately reformist, reinforcing racial identity through assimilation rather than abolishing identity along with the society that upholds its intended purpose. Similar to this is the prideful celebration of wage slavery exclaimed by workers who declare unity with others around the world. This same collectivist perspective convinces an individual that through unity, wage slavery can somehow be more liberated and perhaps revolutionary when unified to overthrow the bosses. I feel like that's a misunderstanding of the reason people talk about it. Like the whole tagline of the IWW is abolish the wage system. I think a lot of like revolutionary ethics that involve like connecting workers are with an aim towards abolishing wage slavery, not like continuing it under some guise of unity. In both instances, an identity originally constructed for control and domination is uplifted and embraced as if to somehow liberate people en masse from the misery that accompanies it. But as demonstrated by capitalism's ever-expanding continuation, working class pride and black empowerment do little to liberate anyone, since neither category represents people who all want the same thing. Internal differences are forever destined to complicate any potential for consistent unity. Ultimately, movements or organizations that originate as genuine threats to the establishment become watered down and manageable by the state. Frustrated with this compromise, the most radical elements of the movement or organization break off and form smaller groups that become specialized by militancy, carrying out clandestine attacks until they dissipate within the current of history. The limitations of every identity-based movement or organization becomes apparent when at the core of its analysis, the individual is absolved of their personal responsibility in contributing to the collective reinforcement of such ideological power, institutions, and governments, industrial society. In order for identity to be functional, an individual not only must accept assigned identity, but become the identity by socially performing the corresponding roles attributed to it. Puts on thigh highs and miniskirt. Industrial civilization masters the art of engineering warfare in a controlled manner. Race and all other socially constructed identities are arranged in a hierarchy to encourage mental and physical civil warfare. The problem of identity is further complicated by the fact that identity assignments and their expected roles of an individual are institutionally backed as well. I can yell, "fuck racial identity" all day and night, but that won't alter the wall of power represented by the material manifestations of white supremacist ideology. Society is a social and institutional arrangement that upholds white supremacist order. So as long as individuals categorized as white surrender to the delusion of racial superiority, and individuals identified by society as non-white continue to embrace an identity which, by colonial design, is the embodiment of inferiority, subservience, and defeat, society will continue to reproduce itself and expand through social and institutional power. Definitely the colonial design of non-white identities is to be like oppressible in the shortest terms possible. But I also feel like a lot of people who like identify actively like with blackness or indigeneity or being Latin or whatever the fuck aren't in their heads are not thinking, oh yeah, I'm black, so I'm inferior. I imagine they're like, I'm black and that's fucking like fine, if not positive in some facet. In the same way I feel like queer people identifying with queerness is like, in my own head, I'm like, no, being trans is based. Being cis is gross. Like, we'll see. We'll see if they address that. In my opinion, and to be blunt, the delusion of racial superiority stems from the same delusion that invented the concept of race in the first place. It's almost as if someone who originally had nothing to fear created something to fear, and then created an ideology, white supremacy, in response to that fear. And as a result, separatism is carried out as the logical response to an imaginary difference. In capitalist society, the subjugation of one group of people is used to effectively subjugate another. The poverty of a racially oppressed group is used to motivate the wage slavery of those considered racially superior. Individuals assigned with white identity are subjected to stressful social and institutional pressures, high expectations, and racial conformity. A white individual is expected to continue the values and traditions of workerist pride, success, and prosperity in order to secure a white future. This is why the inevitable overlap of different races living in poverty poses a threat to the establishment. Any instances where class fails to uphold racial division opens up the possibility of individuals transcending the fear of one another, interacting as unique individuals rather than mere subjects of polarized assigned identities. At the end of the day, both groups of people, despite class or racial differences, are enslaved by identity and by capitalism. Beyond just the objective of white supremacy, this is the project of control and domination over a population of subjugated individuals. Ironically, most physical manifestations of society, cities, highways, and so on, are owned by wealthy white people, but built and maintained largely by people racially assigned inferior value. This irony is similar to my ass having been a wage slave at a casino that guaranteed the demise of my own neighborhood. Also, I had the money to pay bills and eat. But that's precisely the operation of society, isn't it? A large population of subordinate individuals reproducing the imprisoning effect of their identity, by building and maintaining the physical framework that ultimately enslaves them. That's an incisive fucking take right there. Society is identity politics materialized, and capitalism is death by design. However, society is only fully functional as long as individuals continue to collectively build and maintain it. Society, the collectivized power that ultimately dominates each individual born into it, is nevertheless a collection of individual participants. Racialized constructs that govern the existing reality are only empowered by those who personally embrace the powerlessness of assimilation. I might just be one person in an ocean of many others, but nevertheless, I remain hopelessly defiant. Because if our lives are merely just manufactured identities, porters for industrial society, I would much rather have fun sabotaging this ship than spending my life polishing the brass. There's I think a poem. Feral mind, army of one, I am my own infantry. One hand full of mischief, the other black powder poetry. Elites cut the sky like razor blade confetti, globalized capital eco-catastrophe, poison pushers trying to subdue my sobriety, race trying to imprison me with another identity, an animal against the civility of herd mentality, witness as my rage takes aims at society. That line, black powder poetry, capitalism and white supremacy are both violent by design due to the fact that they both accelerate the social engineering of hierarchy between people, ultimately impacting personal survival. The mere existence of anyone not fitting the criteria of white is considered a threat to the white supremacist establishment, and therefore treated like an eternal enemy. Born into this existential war zone, an individual is bombarded with assigned identities and raised with the expectation to fulfill the role of becoming a lifelong wage slave of society. And as history showcases capitalist violence and horrifying racist brutality, which continues today without pause, an individual is confronted by the decision to either assimilate or fight back. When I say anarchy beyond race, I'm referring to a transformational mindset driven by a desire to reclaim life and create experience ungoverned by time and history. For example, a lifestyle of becoming spontaneous and fluid with one's own desires and impulses through abandoning loyalty to social constructs and their web of expectations. To destroy race and society is to self-immolate and storm through years of social conditioning toward an emancipatory nothingness. From this perspective, individualized attack is carried out against the racialized law and order that subjugates the mind. I don't just encourage the pursuit of life beyond racial limitations, but live it by interacting with the social realm as an infinite variety of personalities. From here, attack could be defined as a material confrontation with society, a rebellious creation of destruction that finds expression through the art of fire and sabotage. I also recognize the domesticated bonds between race and human, like the variety of racial constructs. The species construct of human is also forced upon the individual by industrial society. My abandonment of the human identity and role has everything to do with my contempt for industrial civilization and its anthropocentric goal of domination over all living beings. For example, my vegan relationship with non-human animals is intimately connected to my hostility toward the same human supremacy that encouraged the ignorance and hypocrisy found within speciest anti-authoritarians. In addition to the horror of slaughterhouses and their environmental impact, today, non-human animals continue to be viewed as a raw resource for hunting and consumption rather than complex, self-determined individuals. So the same way that I reject the racist expectation of POCs being subordinate to this white supremacist order, I reject the specious expectation of non-human animal subordination to human supremacy, unfathomably based. Whether it's race or species, supremacist ideologies draws strength from participation on an individual level. Industrial society is the end result of this participation collectivized by an expanding population. I have no use for claiming membership to any particular race, and just as my personality can't be fully represented by ethnicity or cultural identification, My physical traits only lead people to make assumptions about what I am. My speech patterns only lead people to make assumptions about where I grew up, but both are irrelevant. It seems that only my enemies seriously care to microscopically examine my socially assigned identity, either to establish my placement in society or to, in a pathetic attempt, politically invalidate my views. My experiences go beyond the simplicity of race, gender, my non-existing bank account, or my location of birth. My personality is as nomadic as my physical being. My home is located at the center of a chaos sphere where only infinite, unknown possibilities lay ahead in every direction. To this day, many liberals and radicals alike continue to make use of their racial identity for a victimist narrative. This victimist narrative is used in more ways than I care to list. More commonly, I have seen it used to exploit white guilt, influence mainstream politics, and shut down critical dialogue. But in terms of destroying society, race-based internalization victimhood is as useless as vote begging for freedom. My assigned identity as POC or black or mulatto or white only has influence on those who place value in the social and institutional manifestations of race. So the same way that government can never give me freedom, the governance of racial constructs will never set me free. My personality escapes the fixed imprisonment of racial and ethnic categorizations as I continue to live, experience, and grow. One will probably ask, what becomes of an individual beyond a racialized construction? Is it an anti-capital life of exploration, traveling, and adventuring, bathing in the timelessness of days without work and nights without a curfew? Is it the conspiring and subsequent attack against the plantation known as industrial society? The possibilities are endless, to each their own. With a society full of career identity politicians who refuse to see life beyond social constructs, individuals will continue to be pressured into categories and their uniqueness exchanged for uniform membership. But despite this, there are rebels who remain undeterred, enemies of society who refuse to surrender to the assimilating virtue of racial identity. Some speak with writing, others prefer to speak only through daily crime against society. Some enjoy both. I am sure there will be some who will find this text redundant, another critique of identity. Fair enough. But allow me to be clear, I write this with the intent of further agitating identity politics by confronting the idea that race is sacred and or above criticism. My anti-fascist, anti-racist views recognize race as nothing more than a social construct, used to govern individuality, despite attempts to personalize it with glory, cultural value, and meaning. Race continues to be just one of many phantoms woven into the fabric of social control and domination. My same desire to destroy white supremacy extends toward any and all racialized supremacist ideologies that attempt to take its place. So whether people call it post-race anarchy or race nihilism, a critique of race could be understood as a necessary rewilding toward the rejection of civilized identity. It's my belief that race can never represent anything more than an instrument of social control. Therefore, I find it useless in regards to my liberation and limited at best in its capacity to accurately represent others. I reject any and all worldviews that assert the mythical perception of individual people as color-coded static beings, a colonial narrative rebranded and regurgitated by the many forms of racial nationalism. My nihilism is a sphere of arrows aimed at every direction toward all that which attempts to impede the wild will of my ego. I advocate nothing less than total mayhem within the castle of white supremacist America. This text, written in the winter of 2022, is dedicated to those who, rather than rewrite the lines of race and identity, set fire to the map. And it ends with a quote. Racial preservation depends upon the development of a conservationist ethic for race or human nature. It requires an ethic, a morality of racial affirmation and conservation to replace the current ethic of racial denial and destruction. A morality with a positive view of race as a good to be appreciated, cherished, valued, loved, and preserved. rather than the current negative view of race as an evil to be discarded, rejected, and destroyed. Such an ethic or morality is the essential foundation of the racial compact. From Richard McCulloch, a white separatist author of several white nationalist books advocating for the maintenance of racial purity. So I'm pretty sure Flowerbomb quotes a Nazi, basically, because the fascist is affirming that in order for things like white supremacy, or as they say it, racial preservation, is that race itself has to be affirmed. That's a good contrast to quote your enemies, because white supremacists are like, we have to affirm race as real and existent and good, appreciated and cherished. That's a persuasive ass quote in favor of like the rest of the essay. Solid move. I would have never thought to do that. I feel like I would always quote something that's just like agreeing with like basically an argument from like community or like authority or like a respected individual. So it's interesting to quote a shithead and be like, you see what the shithead wants. All right, that's all for today. I'm probably gonna be really sad tomorrow, but we're gonna, life is hard sometimes. You know what the Buddha said, separation from things you like is painful. Ain't that the fucking truth? Have a good rest of your time sphere.